Walter. We're here with a brand new episode of The Odd Years, and this is a very special one for me. Here at the Cook Political Report, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. And in honor of this auspicious occasion, we've put our entire archives online. That's right. Decades of political analysis, race ratings, candidate profiles from every House, Senate, and gubernatorial race dating all the way back to our start in 1984. It is a treasure trove of political history, and it's also a lot to dig through. And that's why we're here today. Over the next few weeks on The Odd Years, you'll hear conversations with our team about what they've discovered in their deep dives and why the races, candidates, and trends they've surfaced from the past still matter today. Plus, it's just a ton of fun to dork out over races past and races, well, that could have been. And we're going to start things off today with a place near and dear to my heart, the House. For 10 years, I covered House races for the Cook Political Report. I always told folks it was the best job that I ever had, which is why I'm so excited to kick off our archive session with David Wasserman, Senior Editor and Elections Analyst here at the Cook Political Report. He has spent 17 years as House Editor, where he's established a well-earned reputation as the best House analyst in the business. He's also the nation's top redistricting expert, and you may know him from his Twitter handle, which happens to go by @redistrict. For the release of the Cook Political Report archive, he's put together his list of the defining House races of every cycle from '84 to 2022. And of course, you can read Dave's articles about all 20 defining House races at cookpolitical.com. So Dave, hey.
Hey, I think this is the most fun I've ever had writing for the Cook Political Report.
I mean, right? This is what we live for. You were actually born the same year that the Cook Political Report was born. But I want you to start off talking about another year that is very personal to you, which is 1998 and the race you picked for the race that defined that election cycle.
Yes. So I was a 14-year-old dork growing up in central New Jersey when there was this kind of sleeper house race going on in my district. I lived just north of Princeton, and the 12th congressional district of New Jersey used to extend from Hunterdon County, which is kind of the horse country of New Jersey, pretty Republican area, to Monmouth County, which is near the shore, also a pretty Republican area. And then you had Princeton, and it's 90% liberal electorate in the middle.
Right.
And there was this Princeton plasma physicist named Rush Holt, who was running against a pretty conservative Republican freshman member named Mike Pappas. And this was a district at the time that it was hard to imagine a Democrat winning. But Mike Pappas made a fatal error. Keep in mind what was going on in 1998. It was the impeachment saga. And Pappas, This was not a district that was really a rabid arch conservative district. This is a low tax, free market Republican kind of place.
Exactly.
And Mike Pappas took to the floor of the House with a musical ode to Kenneth Starr.
Twinkle, twinkle, Kenneth Starr, now we see how brave you are. Up above the Pentagon sting, like a fair judge in the ring. Twinkle, twinkle, Kenneth Starr, now we see how brave you are.
The independent counsel. And so that badly out of tune ditty was fodder for a very memorable cable TV ad and a series of mailers that Rush Holt put out. And amid the backlash to Republicans' drive to impeach Bill Clinton, this was one of the biggest upsets of 1998. And I happened to save every mail piece that arrived to our house. And I still had them in a portfolio that I kept in this chest in our closet. And so when we put out this archive piece, I knew that we had to make this the race for 98. And I had to get those mailers out. And that was probably my favorite element of this.
So when you came home from school, where you're like, hey, don't throw out, you said to your mom, like, don't throw out any of these things that you're getting. I want to read them.
I was hooked. And also the other fact was, I thought he was a long shot at the time. Yeah. And on election night, I remember NJN, which was kind of the New Jersey network, covering politics, they declared the Republican incumbent Pappas the winner, but it turned out that the vote totals had been reversed or transposed wrong from Mercer County, which
Oh,
was the most Democratic part of the
right.
district. So when the dust settled, Holt was the winner, and he went on to serve a bunch more terms.
And Dave, he was one of two physicists in the House. And unlike you, who had thought, maybe this could be an upset, this was my first cycle covering that race. I might have kept it in lean Republican, not toss up. And Rush Holt to this day reminds me of that. Dave, let's talk about just how you approached this project, because there are literally thousands of pages of archives, of write ups, of congressional races. How'd you pick the best one from each cycle?
And we should clarify, thousands of those pages were written by you.
Yeah, right.
It was really a lot of fun going back through these election cycles. And, there were a bunch of different ways we could have approached it. We could have picked the nastiest or most expensive race of
Mm,
each cycle. We could have picked the biggest upsets. But what I wanted to do was pick the one race that I felt defined what was going on that year.
hmm
And so it was tough. There were a lot of very close calls out there. When I was speaking with Rich Cohen, one of the authors of the Almanac of American Politics, he pointed out that 13 of the 20 races we picked were defeats of incumbents. And virtually all these races were cases where the seats flipped parties. Also, what stands out to me is the full circle races. And what I mean by that, the names who are still around to this day. Even going back to 1984, where we had this epic race in Indiana's bloody 8th district between Republican Rick McIntyre and Democrat Frank McCloskey. It's infamous because it led to a recount that was run by the House Administration Committee. They kind of rammed through a recount result that had the Democrat ahead by 4 votes. But the Democrat went on to serve until the 1994 wave, when he was beaten by a Republican named John Hostetler. And that same seat is open in 2024. And guess who's running for the open seat? John Hostetler, who lost in the Democratic wave of 2006.
Of 2006. It's also a good reminder that there was a time when a state like Indiana, which, if you had just started covering politics now, you'd say, well, it's a pretty red state. Haven't seen a competitive race there for years. But Southern Indiana, the 8th and the ninth, were both perennial battlegrounds. The thing I also want you to do, and help folks who are listening here understand not just about the archives, but what you do more broadly. How you go about rating these races. And when you were doing the research for picking these races, did you see that there's been much change or difference in the way we analyze races today, or the factors that impact races today versus back in the past?
Yeah, it's not necessarily that politics was less nasty or tumultuous back in the 80s or 90s than it is today. A lot of these races were very fiercely fought and quite negative. But I do think a couple things have changed. First of all, the battleground has gotten a lot narrower. And
Yeah.
we're not talking about Indiana's 8th and ninth districts anymore. Or there was a Republican who held a seat in Manhattan up until 1992. There was a Democrat who was able to win in Utah in 1994. There was in rural Utah, there was a Democrat elected in Idaho in 2008. And
Yeah.
we don't see these kinds of crossover phenomena anymore. Split ticket voting has gone way down, and the threshold for what qualifies as a scandal has gone up.
Has gone way
Right.
up,
So,
right?
in
Uh,
1990, one of the races that was kind of, an honorable mention was the first time that Democrat Colin Peterson won Minnesota's 7th district was in 1990 over a Republican named Arlen Stangeland. And in that race, the Republican was under scrutiny for hundreds of phone calls that he made to a lobbyist who was not his wife. And
Mhm.
the mere rumor of that extramarital affair ended up sinking him and led Peterson to a 30-year career in the House, culminating as chair of the Ag Committee.
These things now just don't, not only did they not rise to the level of scandal, but as you said, like with our partisanship, if you are of that same party as the person who's in the middle of the scandal, you find a way to justify it and look beyond it rather than even giving the opportunity for the other side's candidate to make their case. The other thing I think about when I go back to my time at the House, one of my favorite parts was meeting candidates. I know you love doing that too. So I wonder if you have a couple of candidates that you've met with. We've interviewed hundreds of them who really stick out to you. I could start with my most memorable, which was it in the 2006 cycle, a young candidate named Gabby Giffords running in the Tucson area in southern Arizona. And she was so polished. She had such an impressive background. She had moved, I can't remember where she was working, but she had moved back home to Tucson to help her family's tire business. Um, but I thought, how can this person be real? Just not only did she have all these really impressive bona fides to do the job, but she rode a motorcycle and she was dating an astronaut. And I was like, come on, you can't, no, who is this person? They're not real. So, you could see that almost immediately that this was somebody who was, you know, going to be, if she won that race, was going to be somebody who's going to move up into the ranks of leadership. And I would argue that had it not been for that horrible shooting back in 2010, that she most likely would be in the Senate today or maybe governor.
I still have your notes, by the way, Amy, from all these interviews,
Mm,
and you keep much better notes
which
than
is
I was
crazy.
able to take. You're a very fast writer. But I remember a few really cool interviews that we did. One was with a Republican from Alabama named Martha Roby, and she came in
Mm.
2010. This was actually the district we picked for 2008 when a Democrat named Bobby Bright won this very Republican seat. But she was challenging him 2 years later, and yeah, I always try and find a little bit out about these candidates' personalities, and it was pretty surprising for a conservative running in Alabama that she had gone to NYU and was an aspiring singer back in college. And I asked, you know, who did you want to emulate? And she said, she had blue hair in college and wanted to be Natalie Merchant, but she went on to serve in Congress for almost a decade and got caught up, I think, in kind of the Trump election and the aftermath of
Yep.
that. But uh, on the Democratic side, I remember meeting Val Demings for the first time when she was running against Republican Congressman Dan Webster in Florida back in 2012, I believe it was. And this was a case where she probably would have gotten elected if not for the redistricting lines that Florida Republicans passed that year. The Republican Webster was pretty vulnerable and didn't raise all that much money. Democrats were trying to say that when he was Speaker of the Florida House, he had created a special lounge for lobbyists right outside the chamber, and she had served as police chief in Orlando. And sometimes it takes several cycles for candidates to hit their stride and find their opportunities. So a couple of years later, when the district's lines changed, she did get elected.
Dave, what I think is also really interesting, I think back to when I started. So in 1998, the House had just flipped in 1994 for the first time in 40 years uh, to Republican control. Republicans held on to it until 2006. But since then, we've had the House flip in 10, in 18, and in 22, and we may see it flip again this cycle. How is that happening? We that the the race for the House, as you said, the playing field has gotten smaller and narrower, and yet it's been flipping back and forth more and more.
It's true. I think when you basically have political equilibrium in the country and dissatisfaction with the status quo every 2 or 4 years, you're bound to see the House change hands several times. And I know when you were kind of coming of age in House races, it was taken for granted that Democrats were just going to keep holding the House forever, right? They held it
Yeah.
between 1954
54
till
and yeah.
1994. And
Yeah.
you know, I'm curious, from your first few cycles covering House races, what were your most memorable races to cover from 98 or 2000?
I loved that 2000 cycle. Um, it was one where the House was absolutely on the line in the same way that it is right now. I think it was 5 seats or 6 seats that Republicans had there, just like now, very narrow majority. The conventional wisdom was, oh, it's a presidential year. Clinton's pretty popular, even though he obviously couldn't run for reelection, but the economy is doing well. Democrats are in a good position. How hard could it be to flip the House? But just as we talk about today, the dynamics in these House races doesn't necessarily mirror the national dynamic. And these House races were taking place in districts that were really unique. I remember thinking about that election as, for Democrats, the woulda, coulda, shoulda election, where it was just the smallest things that kept them from getting into the majority. Bad recruits, missed opportunities. This was also the election, Dave, where I was talking to a Democratic strategist afterward about, what happened, what went wrong, not just for the House, but obviously the White House. Um, and he said, we lost in every district that didn't have a Starbucks in it. It was like our first introduction to this realignment that was starting to take place between suburban and more densely populated America and rural, less populated America. That really, Democrats were in rural areas and Republicans were in densely populated areas for a long time. And now in 2000, you start to see these distinctions. Dave, you were really you were when you started, and for I would argue the first sort of 3 cycles, you could call them sort of like backlash, whiplash elections, right? 2008, a continuing backlash against the Iraq War, the Bush era, um, and then 2010, the backlash to Democratic control, and then sort of a resetting in 2012. Talk to us about those years, how you picked those races.
Yeah. So, a year like 2010, which was a 63-seat Republican gain, it's really hard to pick just one race that kind of captured it all.
When did you realize, like, this is not going to just be a bad year for Democrats, but this is going to be like a horrific year?
Right. I think it was when you started to see all of these Democrats head for the exits. There were a
Mm,
lot of open Democratic seats in 2010. People like Bart Gordon from Tennessee,
mm,
and John Tanner, and there were a number of Democrats who stuck around and tried to pull it out. Some of them did, but what I remember most of all was that there was a big debate over whether Democrats who voted against President Obama's agenda on healthcare
right.
and cap and trade were going to do better than the Democrats who had kind of, so to speak, walked the plank and voted for those very controversial pieces of legislation. And one Democrat who had voted against her party on both of those was Stephanie Herseth Sandlin from South Dakota. And it just seemed that no matter what you tried to do, you weren't going to outrun the climate that year. She was facing off
Hmm.
against a Republican state rep you may have heard of, Kristi Noem, who later got elected governor. And she ran a text, Herseth Sandlin ran a textbook reelection campaign. She had won 68% of the vote in a really red state just 2 years prior to that, but still lost by 2 points. And then,
Yeah.
you go to other cycles like 2016, and I remember that Democrats didn't really know what to do about Donald Trump down ballot. They didn't know how to message against Trump's new brand because he was really unpopular, even with a number of Republican voters for much of 2016. And yet, it wasn't easy for Democrats to tie him to Republican incumbents because he really wasn't of Washington.
That's right. He was such an anomaly, that they had to wait till 2018 to be able to do that. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. I don't think Democrats were really able to tie Republicans to him until he was actually in office
Mm,
and had a record to defend. And that's when in 2018 you did see this big surge in female activism on the Democratic side. And I think the defining candidates of that year were Democratic women with national security backgrounds, including
mm.
Spanberger in Virginia and Slotkin in Michigan, Chrissy Houlihan in Pennsylvania, Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey. Those were the people who, when we met them, we were struck by their biographies, but also how their biographies could resonate with the grassroots in the places they were running.
Very good point. I want to just go back a second to Stephanie Herseth because that was also a memorable meeting for me, Dave.
That's right.
So I grew up in suburban Chicago. I don't know anything about farms, farm life, agriculture. Uh, when she was first running, which this must have been 2000, 2002, she talked about the fact that she was from South Dakota, but had been living in DC. She went to Georgetown, was a lawyer in DC. And I said, well, aren't you going to kind of get the carpetbagger thing thrown at you? And she comes from a very well-known political family in the state, but she also talked about growing up on a farm and how she was going to use that to remind people that no, she's not just some outsider, but she's a real South Dakotan. She said, growing up, I raised pheasants. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. And then what would happen? She said, oh, well, what I would do is I would, hatch these pheasants, raise them, and then I'd sell them to the preserve. And I said, oh, well, that's so cute. So they would just go like live in this preserved area. And she's like, no, it's a hunting preserved. And I was like, okay, so you were raising them to be shot at. Okay. Okay. I did not know this was a thing. And Dave, this is what's so fun about covering House races. I learned a lot from candidates. Again, the pheasant thing. You and I had that great meeting with New Mexico too, with Xochitl Torres, who talked about hunting an animal that is normally found on the African Sahara.
I have to chime in here because it's too good a story to
Yeah,
bypass.
do
So
it.
when we
Tell
were
it.
in that meeting, I have to tell you, Amy, for the first 20 minutes of it, I thought she probably wasn't going to win this race because, like Stephanie Herseth, she had a Georgetown degree. She had worked for a law firm in DC, and she was running in a really rural Republican district. And then I think we asked, what do you like to do for fun? And she said, well, for my bachelorette party a couple of years ago, my girlfriends got me a book on field dressing, you know, wild game, and we have this oryx preserve on the White Sands Missile Range where you can apply for permits to hunt oryx. And I don't think either of us really knew what one was.
I had no
Yeah,
idea what an oryx was, or that you would have to field dress it
yeah,
because don't they weigh like hundreds and hundreds of pounds?
exactly. And so that was the moment that tipped it for me at least into the toss-up column.
And then let's talk about 20 and 22 just to wrap it up, because in these cases, it is after 2018, where Democrats, as you said, really were able to tie Republicans to Trump, and that they were successful in that. I think they were hoping that would be the case in 2020 as well, but it really wasn't. And I love the race that you picked. I think that tells us so much about 2020 writ large, as well as for why control of the House almost slipped through Democrats' hands down in South Florida.
That's right. And, this was as much a story about the top of the ticket as it was about the kind of the down ballot Republican strategy, which had gone under the radar for a lot of the cycle. We assumed, a lot of people assumed that Democrats were going to pick up seats. But what happened was Kevin McCarthy, who was really, for all intents and purposes, Republicans' strategist in chief throughout his tenure in the House, he realized that in 2018, out of the 30 new Republicans who had been elected, there were 30 new Republicans in 2018, 29 of them were white guys. And he said, we're not going to let that happen again, because to win in swing districts, we need to recruit and get through primaries people who don't look or sound like Donald Trump. And that is really the key to outrunning him down ticket. And so it was so striking that of the 13 Republicans who unseated Democratic incumbents in 2020, all 13 were women and or minorities. And it was the biggest surprises were in these places where Trump moved the needle in his favor a lot from 2016. So in
Right.
South Florida, even in Orange County, California, where we saw Republicans pick up 2 seats, both Asian American women. But in South Florida, where you had Donna Shalala, who was a 77-year-old Democratic freshman elected in 2018 in a 70% Hispanic district who did not speak Spanish. And then you had a former Univision reporter and anchor, Maria Elvira Salazar.
My American journey started here with $5 in my pocket and Maria Elvira Salazar. I've spent my life holding the corrupt and powerful accountable
and
fighting for
this district didn't even vote for Trump. It voted narrowly for Joe Biden that year, but Shalala was unpopular enough that Salazar was able to get through.
And then we end in 2022, the year that was supposed to vindicate McCarthy. It turns out to be his undoing. But there was one bright spot, and that was in New York State. And it's not often that you see the leader, the head of the party campaign committee going down to defeat. But that's exactly the race that you picked. This is Mike Lawler in New York beating the then DCCC chairman, Sean Patrick Maloney. What else did that race tell us, Dave, about the 2022 cycle?
Well, keep in mind, it was another redistricting cycle. And that meant that a lot of incumbents had to get to know big sets of new voters and new communities they hadn't represented before. And, a lot of politicians have had to make really tough decisions about where to run when their districts have been carved up. And in this case, Sean Patrick Maloney, 75% of his old district ended up in a district to the north of him. 25% of it, including his house, ended up in a district to the south. And he chose to run where he lived, but 75% of the voters hadn't really seen him on a ballot before. And the Republican took advantage of the larger political climate in New York State, where Democrats were really the double incumbents. They ran everything at the state and federal level, and voters were pretty dissatisfied with the economy and inflation, crime, the cash bail proposal Democrats had ushered through Albany. And so all of these kind of formed this perfect storm that took out the DCCC chair.
What was your favorite cycle?
Man, it's Well, I'll tell you, going back through the archives, and there are so many good stories. I urge everyone to flip through some of our paper editions. But 1996 was fascinating to me. That was when I was first
Mm.
starting to kind of get into
So you were
politics. I
12.
was 12, and I think it was
Oh.
this summer when I was 11 or 12. We had a glitch in our cable TV system, and for some reason, we only got the Home Shopping Network and C-SPAN. And so when I got bored of Home Shopping Network and flipped over to C-SPAN, I saw some of these, people speaking from the floor of the house. I was like, who is this raving white-haired guy named Bernard from Vermont? But one character that I remember starkly was a Republican from California named Bob Dornan. And he
Mm.
went by this nickname
B1
B1
Bob.
Bob because he was completely over the top in his rhetoric towards the other side. I mean, yeah, we have Marjorie Taylor Greene today, but back then there was B1 Bob. And when I went through the archives for 96, it was really hard to pick one because that was the year when Loretta Sanchez, a Democrat who, at the time, no one knew, but
Yeah.
she was running this long shot campaign against him in Anaheim, California. She took him out by less than 1,000 votes, and it really marked the rise of Latino voting strength in that
Mm.
part of the suburbs. And it was a bitter defeat for Dornan. But simultaneously that year, you also had a Democrat named Peter Navarro who was running against a Republican congressman named Brian Bilbray. And I would encourage our listeners to go back and read our assessment of then Democrat Peter Navarro, who has since been in the
Gosh,
news.
where is he now? Yeah, that's a good where is he now? Dave, this has been so fun. We could obviously do this for
Of course.
14 more hours, but let's leave it there.
Thanks, Amy, and let's not wait another 40 years to do this again.
I also want to throw this out to our listeners. If you have a race, what race do you think defined a certain year or era? You can leave us a voicemail at 202-738-8530 and press 8. Tell us which race, which year, and why. Or you can send us an email at cookpolitical.com/mailbag, and we'll make sure to highlight as many as we can in our upcoming episodes. If you want to dig deeper into our archives, as Dave suggested, consider subscribing to the Cook Political Report at cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Subscribers also get access to our podcast, The Editor's Roundtable, an inside look at what we're talking about at our weekly editorial meetings. Odd Years listeners can use the discount code ODD, the number 10, so ODD, number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers. The Odd Years is produced by Becca Kaufman, Allie Flynn, and Catherine Ham. Thanks for listening. We'll talk with you next time.